At my grandson's party, my daughter-in-law threw me out of my grandson's birthday party in front of everyone. "Security, get this woman away from the table," she snapped as if I didn't belong. The next day, she found herself cleaning floors at the company she never knew I owned, and I watched her face when the truth hit. "Stay with me till the very end, and let me know where you're watching from, so I can see how far the truth really spreads." I should have known the moment I opened the door that tonight would be different. The air inside my son's house was thick with perfume laughter, and the clinking of glasses, a kind of brittle happiness that didn't include me. I had barely stepped into the foyer, still holding the little gift bag with the sweater I'd knitted for Ethan, when Vanessa's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Security, get this woman away from the table." She didn't even bother to say my name, didn't even look at me as she barked the order from her seat at the head of the long dining table. All 20 or so guests turned to stare, their perfectly made-up faces shifting between curiosity and discomfort. The chatter died instantly, and for a second all I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Ethan was the only one who moved. My sweet grandson jumped down from his chair and ran toward me with his arms open wide, his little voice calling out for Grandma. He wrapped himself around my legs before I could even bend down and hugged me with all the strength a 5-year-old could muster. I held him close, managing a smile for him, even though my chest felt like it was caving in. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I whispered, hoping he couldn't see the tears already gathering in my eyes. Vanessa stood, then her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor as she approached. "Ethan, go back to the table," she said coldly, peeling him away from me as he started to cry. I tried to keep my hand on his shoulder, but she yanked him back, giving me a look that could freeze water. Her nails dug into his little arm as she told one of the caterers to call security. A few of the guests exchanged awkward glances, a couple even looked at me with pity. But no one said a word. And Daniel, my son, just sat there. His eyes stayed fixed on his plate, as if the fine china and steak were more important than the woman who had raised him. My hands trembled as I clutched the sweater still wrapped in tissue paper and tried to keep my back straight. When the uniformed guard finally arrived, he looked almost embarrassed as he gestured for me to follow him. I nodded silently and let him lead me toward the door. Ethan's cries fading behind me as Vanessa's perfectly manicured hand smoothed her dress and she returned to her seat. I didn't look back at Daniel. I couldn't. The evening air outside was cold enough to sting my cheeks as I stepped onto the porch. I stood there for a moment, gripping the gift bag, willing myself not to cry in front of the neighbors. Inside, the laughter had already resumed, muffled by the walls, like nothing had happened at all. As the security guard retreated back into the house, I allowed myself one final glance through the window. Vanessa was smiling now, toasting with her friends, her voice bright and false as if banishing me had made her feel powerful. Daniel was still staring at his plate. And Ethan, my poor Ethan, was sobbing quietly into his little hands. I turned and walked to my car, my heels clicking softly on the concrete, my fingers stiff and cold as they fumbled for my keys. Sitting behind the wheel, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. My heart ached and my pride burned, but somewhere beneath the hurt, something else sparked to life. Tomorrow, I thought, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Tomorrow, she'll learn who really signs her paychecks. There was a time when I thought exhaustion was just a fact of life. In those early years after my husband passed, every day started before sunrise and ended long after the moon was up. I worked 3 jobs back then, cleaning offices at night, waiting tables on weekends, and answering phones at a little tech repair shop in the afternoons just to keep food on the table and Daniel in school. I remember standing in line at the grocery store counting pennies, making sure there was still enough left for his field trip fees and lunch money. Every little dollar mattered, but every smile from him made it all worth it. I told him it was fine, that I was happy to do it, and he never saw me cry into the dishwater when my hands ached so badly I could hardly hold the sponge. It was during one of those long nights at the repair shop that the idea came to me. If other people could build something out of nothing, why couldn't I? I started asking questions, watching over the shoulders of the technicians, taking notes on how systems worked and why they failed. They called me pushy sometimes, even laughed at me, but I learned more there in those years than I ever did at school. When I finally took the leap and registered my own business, people told me I was crazy. What kind of middle-aged widow with no degree thought she could start a company in technology? But I worked during the day and built my client list at night, fixing small networks for local offices and hiring others like me who needed a chance. I named it Collins Tech Solutions, and every time I saw that name on a sign, I felt just a little less invisible. I never told Daniel how successful it became. I didn't want him growing up thinking life would hand him anything. He thought we just managed to get by, that I scraped by with just enough. I let him believe that because I wanted him to work hard, to know what it felt like to earn something on his own. Sometimes, when he was asleep, I would stand at his bedroom door, watching his little chest rise and fall, and tell myself it was all worth it. Every sleepless night, every humiliation, every ache in my back. He was the reason I kept going, even when no one believed in me. So I smiled through all of it, never letting him see just how tired I was. I carried the weight of our lives quietly, because to me nothing mattered more than giving him the kind of future I never got to have. Looking back now, I don't regret a single thing. It didn't happen all at once. At first, it was just a comment here or there, little things Vanessa would say when she thought no one noticed. She'd glance at my sweater and smirk, asking if that was the best I could do for a dinner, out her words, wrapped in a sweetness so thin it almost cut. She'd point out stains on my shoes or tell me how lucky I was to have a son who didn't mind me tagging along to family events. At first, I tried to brush it off, telling myself she didn't mean it, that maybe I was just being too sensitive. But over the years, the words became sharper, harder to ignore, like tiny splinters working deeper under my skin. It hurt most when she started keeping Ethan away. She'd scoop him up and steer him toward his cousins whenever I sat down beside him, whispering something about how Grandma needed her rest. Once he reached for my hand, and she yanked his little fingers back, telling him not to bother me like I was some fragile relic collecting dust in the corner. Daniel never said anything. That silence of his was worse than anything Vanessa ever said. I'd look at him sometimes, hoping for even just a glance of disapproval in her direction, some small sign that he saw me and cared. But he'd just lower his eyes and let her lead, pretending not to hear, when she called me a burden in front of the babysitter or told her friends I didn't know when to stay home. There were times when I sat in my car, outside their house, gripping the steering wheel, and asked myself what I'd done to deserve that kind of contempt. I thought about all the nights I'd gone without so Daniel could have enough, and I wondered how that little boy who once made me macaroni on Mother's Day could just sit there while she made me feel invisible. She never raised her voice. She didn't have to. Every sigh, every fake smile, every glance that lingered on my hands or my hairline was enough to remind me of what she thought I was. Less. Embarrassing. In the way. And every time it happened, something in me cracked, just a little more. Until there were nights I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling and wonder how long I could keep swallowing my pride before it swallowed me whole. The dining room was too bright, too loud, and too perfect. Crystal glasses sparkled under the chandelier, and the polished wood table stretched almost the length of the room, lined with guests, dressed like they were attending a gala instead of a little boy's birthday party. My heels clicked softly on the floor as I stepped inside, clutching the small gift bag with Ethan's hand-knitted sweater, tucked neatly in tissue paper. And for just a second, I thought maybe no one had noticed me arrive. Then Vanessa's voice cut through the air, sharp enough to stop conversation mid-sentence. "Security, get this woman away from the table." My breath caught in my chest as all eyes turned toward me, a dozen expressions painted with confusion, curiosity, and something worse. Pity. Before I could speak, before I could even process the words, I felt a small pair of arms around my waist. Ethan's little face buried against me as he whispered that he missed me. He looked up at me with tearful eyes, asking if I'd tell him the princess story before bedtime. My knees almost buckled, but I held him close and forced a smile, telling him I'd tell him later if his mommy said it was okay. Vanessa was already on me, then her fingers closing around Ethan's arm and pulling him back like I was dirty, dangerous, unwelcome. She hissed at him to go sit down and reminded him that Grandma had to wash her hands before touching his new clothes. He whimpered as she dragged him away, and I stood frozen, hearing the quiet murmurs ripple around the table as guests exchanged uneasy glances. The table was beautifully set, rows of plates and cutlery lined up with military precision napkins folded into perfect shapes, candles flickering gently as though nothing at all was wrong. My place was set too, but it was at the far end, squeezed between an empty chair and a man I didn't recognize who didn't even bother to look at me. The air smelled of expensive wine and roasted meat, but I couldn't taste a thing as I sat and stared at my lap, trying to ignore the heat rising to my face. Halfway through the main course, Vanessa's laughter rang out brittle and bright. She leaned forward and announced for everyone to hear that I was still working at my little cleaning company. She dragged out the word little, letting it drip with condescension as she smiled sweetly in my direction. Several heads turned toward me, eyes scanning my plain black dress, and someone even chuckled softly as if on cue. I swallowed hard and nodded, saying nothing, praying the moment would pass. But she wasn't finished. She added that it was good I had something to keep me busy at my age, otherwise I'd just be a burden. That word hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking. A burden. Ethan squirmed out of his seat again, then running toward me with his chocolate-streaked fingers stretched out, begging for the princess story. He climbed into my lap before Vanessa could stop him and looked up at me, eyes shining like he'd been waiting for this all night. I opened my mouth to begin the tale I'd made up just for him years ago about the clever little princess who didn't need saving when Vanessa's voice cracked across the room. Not here. Not now. Get down from there right this second. Her tone was so sharp that even the man beside me finally looked up, startled. Vanessa yanked Ethan from my lap so roughly he cried out, and she glared at me with nothing but contempt. I tried to plead, saying it was his birthday, but my words barely escaped before she called to a caterer standing nearby. Would you kindly escort this woman out? She's disturbing the dinner. For a moment, the room was silent, every single person staring at me, some wide-eyed, some looking away, as though ashamed for me, but unwilling to speak up. I glanced down the table to Daniel, silently begging him to say something, to stand up, to do anything at all. But he just stared at his plate, his fork unmoving. I stood slowly smoothing the front of my dress, feeling everyone's eyes burn into my back as I turned away. My legs felt stiff and heavy, but I kept my head up as I walked toward the door, clutching Ethan's little gift bag tight in my hand. The sound of his quiet sobs followed me until the door closed behind me and the chatter in the dining room resumed as if nothing had happened. The night air outside was cold against my cheeks, but it felt almost good after the suffocating heat of the room. I stood on the porch for a moment, staring up at the stars, willing myself not to cry. Then I straightened my shoulders and walked to my car, each step steadier than the last. If she wanted me to feel small tonight, she had succeeded. But as I slid behind the wheel and started the engine, one thought burned clear in my mind. This would be the last time she ever made me feel that way. Tomorrow, she would finally understand who she was dealing with. I arrived at the office before the sun was fully up, the building still quiet and dark as I slipped in through the side entrance. The janitor's uniform felt stiff and strange on my shoulders, but it served its purpose, Nobody glanced twice at me as I pushed a cart loaded with supplies into the elevator and rode it up to the 38th floor. I'd built this company with my own hands. Every square foot of polished marble and glass carried a memory of late nights and impossible choices. But this morning, I didn't let myself think about that. I focused on the plan, on what needed to be done, letting the weight of what happened last night harden into something sharp and cold inside me. The floor was already bustling when I stepped out. Phones ringing, heels clicking, conversations buzzing just under the music playing softly through the ceiling speakers. I stayed to the edges, wiping down counters, emptying bins, keeping my head down just enough to look invisible. From this angle, I could see everything. Vanessa's laugh reached me first. It was bright and hollow, echoing across the open office as she leaned on someone's desk and scolded a man twice her age. She told him his report looked like something a high schooler would turn in, and that maybe it was time he considered retirement if he couldn't keep up. The words dripped with disdain, but no one dared to challenge her. I kept moving, polishing a nearby window while I watched her work the room. She barked at another employee about leaving fingerprints on a printer, calling him careless under her breath, and rolled her eyes when the receptionist apologized for missing a call. She spoke to the older ones differently, sharper, as though she was reminding them just how replaceable they were. It struck me how easily she slipped into that role, how natural cruelty seemed to come to her. And no one stopped her. Not the managers who should have been watching. Not the employees, too afraid to speak up. I saw one man in his 60s lower his head after she dismissed him with a wave of her hand, his shoulders sagging as he shuffled back to his cubicle. I stood there, clutching my rag just a little tighter, and reminded myself to breathe. Every word she hurled, every sneer she delivered, only made my decision clearer. I would not let her keep doing this. Not to them, and not to me. As I wiped down a row of empty desks, I caught her glancing at me with a fleeting look of annoyance, as though my presence somehow offended her. She didn't recognize me, of course. To her, I was just another nobody in a uniform beneath her notice. That suited me just fine. It was exactly what I wanted her to think. Because the next move would be mine, and she would never see it coming. By the time I slipped back into my office later that morning, my mind was clear and steady. I hung the janitor's jacket on the back of the door and sat at my desk, pulling up the company's HR files on my screen. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. The first complaint was from a woman in accounting who had been here almost 20 years. She wrote about how Vanessa humiliated her during a meeting, mocking her as slow and outdated in front of the whole department. HR had dismissed it as a misunderstanding and filed it away without action. The second came from an IT technician who said she forced him to work late on her personal projects, calling him too old to keep up with modern systems. His complaint had also been brushed aside, buried under a supervisor's note praising Vanessa's high standards. The third was from a custodial supervisor who described being berated for not immediately dropping her duties to clean up after Vanessa's spilled coffee. She was reassigned to the night shift not long after. I scrolled through them one by one, my anger cooling into something more deliberate. There was no question about it anymore. This wasn't just about how she treated me at that party. It was about the way she treated everyone she thought was beneath her. I called for Jennifer from HR, and she arrived quickly, looking nervous when she saw my expression. I asked for the full organizational chart of Vanessa's division and any additional notes about turnover. Jennifer admitted her team had noticed a troubling pattern, but didn't want to escalate without hard proof. I told her she had everything she needed now. When she asked what I wanted to do, I didn't hesitate. Vanessa would be transferred to janitorial services effective immediately. I told Jennifer to phrase it as a temporary reassignment, part of a new cross-training initiative, but made it clear there was nothing temporary about the lesson I intended her to learn. Jennifer's eyes widened as she realized what this meant, but she nodded and got to work drafting the paperwork. I leaned back in my chair as the city skyline stretched out in front of me, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Control. Vanessa thought she understood power. She thought it was about titles and tables and the ability to humiliate someone just because she could. She was about to learn what real power looked like. It didn't need to shout or wave itself around. It simply acted quietly and decisively. By the time I signed the transfer order an hour later, I felt almost calm. She would show up tomorrow, expecting to climb another rung on the ladder. And instead, she would find herself holding a mop and a bucket. And when she looked up and realized who had put her there, it would already be too late. Vanessa showed up the next morning in a crisp blouse and tailored skirt, clearly thinking her reassignment was some kind of clerical mistake. The look on her face when she was handed a janitor's uniform and pointed toward the supply closet was one I would remember for a long time. She didn't argue, though, not outright, just stood there clutching the folded shirt with her lips pressed tight and her eyes blazing. By the end of her first shift, she already looked different. Her perfectly done hair hung limp around her face, and her hands were red from scrubbing. I watched her from the end of the hallway as she knelt to clean the baseboards outside the conference room, muttering under her breath when people walked past without so much as a glance. The next day was worse for her. She spilled a bucket of dirty water outside the elevators and nearly slipped trying to mop it up, drawing laughs from 2 interns passing by. I caught her scowling at their backs, her knuckles white on the handle of her mop. She had thought she was above this, and now it was written all over her that she still believed it. Each morning, I arrived early, walking the floors under the pretense of checking on operations, though really it was to see her. She never looked up at me as I passed, too focused on emptying trash bins and wiping down restroom counters, but I caught the way her jaw clenched every time another executive breezed by her without noticing. She was polite enough to the other custodial staff, though only when she thought someone was listening. More than once, I overheard her snapping at an older man who moved too slow, or rolling her eyes at a woman trying to show her how to properly polish a brass handle. She called their work mindless one afternoon, not realizing I was standing just around the corner. I had hoped the work might soften her, that seeing the dignity of those who kept this building running would teach her something. But the more she scrubbed, the harder her edges seemed to get. She moved through the hallways like she was walking through a punishment she didn't deserve, like every paper towel she threw away was another insult to her pride. From my office window, I could see her sometimes pushing her cart down the executive floor, with her head held just high enough to tell herself she hadn't been broken yet. Watching her filled me with quiet disappointment, though not surprise. She still hadn't learned. Not yet, but I told myself I could wait. She wasn't the only one who knew how to be patient. At exactly 10 o'clock, I buzzed Helen and told her to send Vanessa in. I stayed seated at my desk with my chair turned slightly toward the window, letting her wait in silence for a few moments after she walked through the door. I heard the sharp click of her shoes on the marble and the faint scrape of the door closing behind her as she cleared her throat and tried to steady her voice. She started talking before I even looked at her. She said there must have been some mistake, that she didn't understand why she had been reassigned to janitorial work, that it was beneath her qualifications. I turned slowly, then finally meeting her eyes, and in that moment, I saw recognition wash over her face. The color drained from her cheeks as she took a step back, whispering my name like it was a question she already knew the answer to. I let the silence stretch, watching her expression shift from confusion to horror, and finally to panic. She glanced around my office as though searching for proof this was all some kind of elaborate joke. I told her to sit down, and she obeyed, her movements stiff and mechanical. Then I began to speak, my tone calm but firm, listing the complaints against her one by one. I told her how she humiliated Margaret in accounting during a budget meeting, how she forced overtime onto Robert in IT while calling him too slow, how she bullied Janet from custodial and had her sent to the night shift because she wouldn't drop everything to clean up after her. Vanessa tried to interrupt, insisting they were misunderstandings, that she was only trying to maintain standards. I cut her off with a look sharp enough to silence her. I reminded her of the way she treated me at the party, the names she called me in my own son's house, the way she humiliated me in front of my grandson. I told her she made one very big mistake. She underestimated me. Her lips pressed into a thin line as I leaned forward and gave her two choices. She could keep working as a janitor and finish what she had started. Or she could resign immediately and walk out of this building with what little dignity she had left. She stared at me, her hands twisting in her lap as her breath came fast and uneven. There was no shouting, no pleading, just the quiet sound of her pride cracking as she realized what she was up against. I stood and crossed to the window, looking out at the city below, as I told her the choice was hers, but that either way, her days of stepping on people to climb higher were over. She didn't answer right away. But when she finally stood, I didn't even have to look at her to know which choice she had made. Vanessa chose to stay. She put the uniform back on the next morning and pushed her cart down the hall with her head high and her pride intact, at least on the surface. But even from my office, I could feel the bitterness radiating off her as she worked every clang of a mop bucket and slam of a supply closet door, a quiet declaration that she still believed she was the victim. The weeks passed, and nothing changed in her. She avoided the other janitors except when she needed someone to blame for her mistakes. I heard her muttering under her breath about how unfair the company was, about how people were jealous of her success and had conspired to tear her down. Even after everything, she still refused to look inward. I wanted to believe she would learn something. I wanted to believe that hard work and humility might open her eyes to the dignity in the people she'd dismissed. But each day, that hope dimmed a little more as I watched her roll her eyes at the people training her, whisper cruel things she thought I couldn't hear, and carry herself like every task was beneath her. Daniel called me one evening, his voice quiet and tense, as though he'd been rehearsing what to say. He said he didn't understand what I was doing to his wife, that she came home exhausted and humiliated every night, and that he couldn't stand to see her suffer like this anymore. He asked me if punishing her was worth breaking apart the family. I sat in my chair and let his words hang in the air before answering. I told him that love was not letting someone hurt others just because you didn't want to hurt them. Love was not turning away when the people around you suffered so one person could feel comfortable. Love was doing what was right even when it was hard. He didn't speak for a long time after that. When he finally did, his voice cracked a little, and he admitted he hadn't recognized the woman his wife had become. He said he'd seen the way she spoke to people in the office when she thought no one was watching. He sounded tired in a way I hadn't heard since he was a boy who came home from school with bruises on his knees and tears in his eyes because another kid had pushed him around. I told him gently that he had a choice now. He could keep making excuses for her, or he could start being the man I knew he was capable of being. I reminded him that the little boy I raised always stood up for the underdog, always gave what he had, even when it wasn't much. There was a long silence before he finally said he needed time to think. I told him I understood, even though a part of me ached, knowing he might choose her over me again. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table and thought about all the choices I'd made that had led me here. My hands trembled a little as I folded Ethan's sweater and set it neatly in the gift bag, still waiting for the day I could finally give it to him. The house was quiet, but not empty. There was a calm in me now, even in the loneliness, because I knew I'd done what was right. Even when it hurt, even when it meant standing alone, some things were worth it, and I'd stand my ground for as long as it took. Looking back now, I've come to understand that real power was never about the title on my office door or the size of my paycheck. It was never about being able to tear someone down just because I could. Real power, the kind that matters, comes from lifting other people up and knowing you've left them better than you found them. That's what I chose to do once the dust settled. I created new training programs for my older employees, helping them grow into leadership roles where their experience could shine. I funded scholarships for their children and grandchildren because I knew what it meant to struggle and how much a little help could change a family's future. Daniel began to change too. Slowly, but I saw it in him each time he came by to talk or watched me work. He started noticing the people around him noticing me, and I could see him wrestling with his own mistakes as he tried to do better. And Ethan still calls me his princess. Every time he sees me, he runs into my arms and asks for the story about the princess who saved herself. I tell it with the same smile and the same quiet pride, because he doesn't need to know yet just how much truth there is in it. If there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this. You don't have to let people treat you like you're less than you are just to keep the peace. You can stand your ground even if it means standing alone for a while. And you can choose kindness and still hold people accountable. So now I'm asking you, what would you have done if you were in my place? Have you ever had to stand up for yourself when no one else would? Tell me. I'd love to hear your story too.